There are few experiences in modern life that can rival the quiet awe of sitting by a fire in total silence. That hypnotic dance of flame, the warm breath of heat kissing frozen skin. But for a pioneer family in the winter of 1812, the fire wasn't ambiance, it was everything. Heat wasn't a luxury, it was a line between alive and less conversational than a frozen turnip. Out on the 19th century American frontier, winters were not politely announced affairs. They did not nibble at the edges of October and crescendo into postcard snowfalls in December. No. Winter arrived like a sledgehammer to the kneecaps of hope. Cold, brutal, and often carrying subtle suggestions that you should have gathered more firewood. And that brings us, quite inevitably, to the modest log cabin. Ah, the log cabin, wildly romanticized by painters, poets, and people who've never tried to hold in heat with walls made entirely of slightly ambitious bark. These cabins were often hastily built during the more optimistic months, those heady days when the sun was still giving out free vitamin D and frostbite was just a rumor spread by cranky squirrels. Walls were not insulated. Windows, if they existed, were often covered in grease paper. This was exactly what it sounds like. Imagine trying to see the world through the wrapper of a sausage roll. And doors. If they fit the frame, people cheered. If they didn't, well, that was just more ventilation. Breezy was both the architectural style and the indoor climate. To make matters even cozier, roofs leaked. Snow didn't concern itself overly with distinctions between indoors and outdoors. It had grace, it had ambition, and it wanted to see the hearth. The heart of the winter cabin was the hearth, the fireplace. It doubled as stove, furnace, spiritual center, and place where small children burned their fingers trying to roast stolen potatoes. Fires were kept going constantly, day and night, which sounds comforting, until you realize someone had the job of waking up every few hours to feed the fire. Because in a room like that, without heat, you didn't sleep in, you froze in. Now let's talk delightfully grim numbers. A reasonably sized log cabin could go through up to 40 cords of wood in a winter. A cord is 128 cubic feet of wood. That's roughly, well, put it this way. Imagine chopping wood until your will to exist became theoretical. Then do it again tomorrow, and maybe again after lunch. Pioneer families began preparations in late summer or early autumn, preserving vegetables, salting pork, sewing clothing, and, somewhat optimistically, trying to patch holes in the walls with mud, moss, or occasionally, an emotionally vulnerable raccoon. Woolen garments and quilts were sewn from homespun fabric, and mittens were considered heirlooms, not because they were fancy, but because losing one could be a genuinely existential crisis. Clothing layers were key. You didn't wear a coat. You wore your entire closet. Little boys often looked like walking haystacks in scarves, trousers over trousers, and mufflers that reached their eyebrows. If you fell down in all those layers, it took a team of oxen and an encouraging speech to get you standing again. Meals in winter were joyfully repetitive. Stews, perhaps even a porridge if fortunes were smiling. Meals had to do the work of calorie warmth and morale maintenance, which is probably why frontier recipes mostly consisted of boil whatever hasn't frozen solid, followed by pray no one notices it's mostly turnip. Entertainment was creative. Winter nights were long, so people told stories, sang songs, carved spoons, yes spoons, or stared into the fire in that special way only someone who hasn't seen the color green in 5 months can. Children might play games involving string, buttons, or imaginatively named wooden blocks. And of course, one could always pass the time, contemplating snow accumulation with the reverence of a monk watching sand fall through an hourglass. Despite the grimness, or perhaps because of it, there was a strange kind of closeness in those cabins. Literal and emotional. You couldn't help but stay warm together, packed side by side like sleepy sardines in woolen layers, under quilts that weighed more than your regrets. There were no thermostats, no weather apps, and not a single scented candle in sight. But what they did have was grit, ingenuity, and a working theory that hot cider could fix roughly 62% of all known problems. And in this crucible of chill, a unique kind of frontier spirit was forged, one that handled hardship with humor, found joy in a well-made mitt, and still managed to look at a snowstorm and whisper, "Well, at least it's keeping the bears quiet." If these stories helps you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Let the frost settle softly now, and we'll pick up again where the fire crackles and the wind remembers your name. By December, the sun was little more than a polite suggestion on the horizon. The pioneer morning began not with birdsong, but with the internal debate of whether leaving the warmth of one's bed quilts was worth the toe-numbing trip to the chamber pot. Most decided, eventually. Roosters, unaware of how little their talents were appreciated in sub-zero dawn, still crowed with the gall of Broadway tenors. But everyone else trudged on, layered in wool, flannel, and whatever else might stave off the frosty wrath of the great outdoors, which, inconveniently, included the kitchen. You see, your average 19th century frontier home was less a well-insulated dwelling and more a carefully balanced pile of timber, generous gaps included. That rustic, breezy charm, less charming at 5 in the morning when the breeze was mostly ice. In fact, some families kept a hammer on the inside windowsill, not for home repair, but to crack the frost off the glass so they could see what kind of day they'd be enduring. The communal bed was the warmest place in the house, and quite often held mom, dad, 2 to 5 kids, and occasionally a terrified chicken who had evaded its destiny long enough to nuzzle in beside the baby for a nap. Privacy back then was a luxury reserved for fiction and bears. Firewood was the currency of winter survival, and cutting it was both a necessity and a lifestyle. Nearly every waking daylight hour revolved around it. Chopping wood, hauling wood, stacking wood, arguing about who stacked the wood improperly, restacking it. It was the cracked and splintered backbone of frontier domestic life. Every pioneer child quickly learned that go get more firewood was not a cheerful suggestion, but the Appalachian version of happy holidays. Now, the hearth fire. Ah yes, the home's reluctant heart. It didn't so much heat the entire house as politely warm the area within 3 feet of it. Families rotated through like rotisserie chickens, soaking in a moment of earthly warmth before braving the Arctic realms of the cabin's far corners. Uneven heating meant unequally thawed persons. One side of your body toasted, the other hosting a colony of icicles. Outside, snow accumulated faster than Grandpa's bedtime exaggerations. Paths to the privy had to be shoveled constantly, lest breadcrumbs and a compass become necessary just to relieve oneself. There are suspiciously consistent tales of folks getting halfway there before snowstorms redirected their journey to somewhere entirely else, like the barn or existential reflection. Layers were crucial. Wool socks were not a trendy knitwear statement. They were the reason your toes still had names. petticoats and long johns multiplied like rabbits. Sometimes you were wearing so many layers your own family didn't recognize you until you sneezed your signature sneeze, which in frontier times could also double as an avalanche warning. And yet, food. Lovely food, the sparkle of the frontier kitchen, even if it mostly came in the form of potatoes, salted pork, and a constant questioning of how many ways you could prepare beans without inviting revolt. Meals were ceremonious acts of survival with a dash of creative masochism. Dried apple pie, for instance, was indeed made from apples so dried they resembled antique paper, reconstituted through boiling until they became edible hope. Of course, nothing boosted morale like molasses. If you had any, that was gold, literally. When poured on warm cornbread or snow, yes, snow sugar candy was a thing before Instagram made it cool. It transformed a bleak, bitter evening into something almost festive. Many a family marked special occasions with dessert, rationing a single molasses cookie between 6 people like it was the last rations on a moonless ship. For fun, because even misery needs a hobby. Pioneer families turned to storytelling. Picture a firelight circle. Knitters, menders, minor frostbite victims, all gathered as Grandpa spun yet another tale about the time I punched a bear, or how I walked backwards in the snow uphill with no shoes and a full cow on my back. The more unbelievable the story, the warmer it seemed to make the room feel. Suspicion that warmth was purely psychological? Absolutely. But by then, no one cared. Outside, the chill deepened. Timber groaned with cold. The stars blinked like frozen sparks, too high and far to help. Inside, life simmered in its own way, under quilts, near embers, and around dishes of something vaguely stew-like. And as the wind began to nudge snowdrifts against the cabin walls, creeping in through the corners despite everyone's best efforts, the family reshuffled, blanket by blanket, person by person, drawing close again, framing the fire's flicker with tired, smoke-scented shoulders. Tomorrow, they'd rise to the same cold battles, the same frost-bitten rituals. But for now, in the hush just before sleep, breath clouded toward the ceiling, and the stories lingered in the rafters, waiting. And the little house, half log, half wishful thinking, braced itself for the frozen unknown of breakfast. You could always tell when winter had truly arrived on the frontier, not because of snowfall, that was a given, or the sudden disappearance of the sun behind a grey woolen sky for days at a time, but because your bread knife froze to your hand before you even touched the loaf. In the charmingly underestimated art of frontier survival, winter was the season that didn't just knock on the door with a polite cough. It kicked it open, tracked snow across your floorboards, and demanded everyone share their body heat or perish. And families obliged. If you lived in a one-room log cabin with 10 other people clinging to a fireplace the size of a marmot, you'd be a little clingy too. Let us first understand the central heating system of most pioneer homes, the fireplace. This was not the picturesque stone hearth of your average Hallmark Christmas movie. This fireplace was usually loosely stacked stones or, if you were lucky, mortared bricks, with a chimney that may or may not have remembered it was supposed to take smoke outside. The fire had one job: to heat the room. It attempted this like a drunk trying to spread butter using a fork, enthusiastically and with little success. There were mornings when you'd wake up to find your socks frozen in position, doing little contortionist dances on the wooden floor, and forget about washing anything during the deepest parts of winter. The water in the bucket turned into a stubborn block of ice that glared at you as if to say, "Go ahead, try it. I dare you. Now, the women of the household, mothers, aunts, grandmothers, anyone capable of wielding a ladle and ruling with quiet authority, were usually up well before dawn, their breath puffed in little clouds as they stoked the embers of last night's fire and thanked their lucky stars that it hadn't gone completely out. Restarting from scratch in midnight temperatures was about as fun as bathing a badger. And yes, the term banking the fire was not about finances. It was the serious and slightly mystical act of burying embers under ash so they'd be alive the next morning. Like a phoenix, only sweatier. Children, wrapped in quilts that smelled like wood smoke and long-dead raccoons, often slept three to a bed in an arrangement less suited to comfort and more to collective heat production. The smallest ones became what modern engineers might call biological foot warmers, though the career was unpaid and full of complaints. But what of insulation, you ask? Ah, sweet listener, few cabins were insulated in any meaningful sense. Walls were logs, and between those logs were chinks, spaces generously filled with mud, sticks, and hope. These would harden like concrete and crack like brittle old stories. Some families added newspapers to the inside walls to trap warm air. It did boost the temperature ever so slightly, and had the charming bonus of making your dreams politically informed. Blankets. Yes, but wool was gold. Pioneers didn't exactly have closets full of down comforters. Instead, they layered everything from stitched-together scraps of clothing to old coats. And if things got truly desperate, even a flannel petticoat or two. Quilts doubled as history books, each patch telling a story from a shirt, a dress, or the one time Uncle Eli tried to wrestle a possum and lost, again. Then came the wind. It blew right through the walls, curled under doors, and snuck down the back of your neck like an appropriate Victorian villain. Doors rattled in their frames. Windows, if you had them frosted over in lacy, blooms, and if things got loud enough, you might assume wolves had taken up brass instruments outside. In all this shivering glory, one might wonder why anyone stayed. Community, oddly enough, had a lot to do with it. People leaned on each other, shared what little they had, and passed long evenings with fiddles, stories, and laughter that steamed in the cold air. When it's too cold to do anything else, stories bloom in even the iciest soil. And speaking of blooming, before we nod off completely, let us follow one of those drifting pine-scented breezes outside the cabin, where our next curiosity waits patiently. How did people, cut off by snow and surrounded by wilderness, get their food in winter, without resorting to boiled boots? That, dear dreamer, is a tale best left to unfold gently in the warmth of another frozen day. On the frontier, warmth was a luxury that could not be bought, especially when all the general store had was salted pork, wool socks, and exactly zero patience for credit. So families turned to the only reliable source of winter heat, besides the occasional marital argument, firewood. Now, if you've ever romanticized the idea of chopping wood in a frosted clearing, flannel shirt slightly unbuttoned, beard glistening with snowflakes, let me gently correct that charming vision. Pioneers didn't chop wood because it was quaint. They chopped wood because hypothermia was quantifiably worse. The average frontier family could burn through 20 to 30 cords of wood in a single winter. That's not just a stack or two. That's a veritable forest, politely relocated to your hearth one log at a time. Men, women, and older children all took part, swinging axes and mauls with the tired determination of people who had endured livestock births in January. The days before winter saw a kind of firewood frenzy, a wood-cutting marathon during which every able-bodied person pretended they weren't incredibly tired of trees. Standing timber was felled with the sort of grudging reverence usually reserved for bad in-laws, respected, necessary, and extremely hard to get rid of. The logs were then split with tools that had names like wedge, sledge, and that blasted behemoth, and stacked in tidy piles that looked deceptively peaceful next to the chaos it took to make them. These piles weren't purely aesthetic either. Their arrangement often followed a careful code. Bark side up for quicker drying, split ends facing the wind, strategic gaps for air circulation. A misstacked wood pile could trap moisture, breed mold, and collapse at 2 a.m. in what could only be described as an unexpected and deeply insulting landslide. Once chopped, the firewood was lovingly stored in the woodsheds, lean-tos, or simply beside the house, guarded like treasure. And why not? In a storm, when snow came down sideways and your nose had contemplated freezing off, a good stack of seasoned oak felt more valuable than currency. In fact, some frontier folks lovingly named their stacks. "That's June's pile," they'd say, patting it as one might a dog. "She'll see us through the second thaw." Inside the cabin, the hearth came to life. This was the center of all things: cooking, heating, storytelling, and the occasional attempt to dry socks that would end in a light smoking. The fire's glow gave a comforting rhythm to the day. It crackled in the early morning while coffee boiled in a dented pot. It listened silently while children recited scripture or spelling words during homeschool sessions that took place at the table, which also happened to be the surgical center, ironing board, and puppet theater. Managing a fire was both art and science. Too little kindling, and you'd spend half the day issuing polite threats to the chimney. Too much, and you might overheat, leading to the bizarre frontier ritual of opening the door mid-blizzard just to let the frost back in. Temperature regulation was achieved through a delicate game of log, wait, log, damper, swear, poker, repeat, and stoking the fire at midnight in a bitter volant windstorm. That was an extreme sport, but oh, the warmth. The hearth radiated not just heat, but courage. Families would gather close together under patchwork quilts, sipping broth, peeling apples with red hands, telling stories of warmer days or taller tales of even colder winters. Every inch away from the hearth meant degrees lost, both in temperature and enthusiasm. Even the dog, the loyal fur brick, would curl directly in front of the flames like a sentient tripping hazard. Still, as romantic as all this might sound now, it was grindwork. Lips cracked, skin chapped, noses ran without permission, and heaven help the soul who ran out of dry logs before the thaw. They would quickly learn why neighbors impressed upon each other the seriousness of proper stockpiling. Generosity was common, but so was a certain raised eyebrow that said, "Didn't I warn you in August?" Yet in all that daily shoveling, splintering, and smoky exhaling, something very soft burned too. A quiet pride. Fire demanded attention. It was a constant relationship that paid back in warmth, if cared for deliberately. It reminded pioneers, in case they forget for 5 seconds, that survival on the frontier wasn't a sprint or even a marathon. It was an extended performance art piece starring wind, wood, and wool. And with the hearth's soft hiss still echoing, you might be wondering, just what kind of food could possibly be cooked in a fireplace that doubled as a toaster, stew pot, and accidental chimney sweep? Well then, stir the coals gently and follow their glow into something truly delicious. Some of the things we take most for granted in winter, like coats that don't resemble boiled horses, mittens that don't betray you at the first snowball, and central heating that doesn't involve chopping down half a forest were, for pioneers on the Americanist frontier, luxuries as distant and unimaginable as a pumpkin spice latte in July. Let's place ourselves quietly now, in a small log cabin nestled somewhere along a snowy bend in the Ohio Valley. It is late December. The wind is muttering insults through every cracked chink in the cabin's walls, and the fire in the hearth is doing its best impression of a candle on its last breath. Inside, a family, maybe 7 of them perched around whatever warmth they can muster, huddle beneath quilts heavier than Uncle Silas's sense of humour. Ah, the quilt, the unsung hero of the frontier winter. These weren't the soft down-filled numbers you'll steal from your partner at 2 a.m. These were hand-stitched behemoths, usually made from worn-out clothing, animal hides, and the occasional sack of flour that had retired from active duty. A really good quilt could weigh more than a toddler and had the stopping power of a wooden fence. Slipping one over you at night was basically agreeing to sleep in mild captivity. Despite the freezing temperatures, layering up wasn't as easy as rummaging through a closet and throwing on a fleece. Frontier families owned clothes in the same sense that a squirrel owns acorns, sparingly and with grim purpose. One good wool shirt might carry a man through a full season, possibly 2, provided it didn't disintegrate or decide to mysteriously vanish during wash day, which had a reputation for claiming more garments than fire. And speaking of washing, oh, warmth's mortal enemy, our bathing in the winter was discouraged. Not exactly because people enjoyed being grimy, but more because turning into a human icicle mid-scrub was considered an unfavourable outcome. In some settlements, winter was a time to, let's just say, adopt a waited-out philosophy about personal hygiene. You wore sweaters not just for warmth, but as a sort of barrier between you and your own evolving scent. At night, the air inside the cabin could freeze the breath, right out of a sentence. Many families would stack sleep, children toward the center, older folk on the edges, like a tightly wound burrito of humanity, hoping that collective body heat might bully the cold into temporary retreat. Feet were often wrapped in burlap sacks, or, if you were lucky, tucked into a makeshift foot warmer filled with hot rocks. Not that the rocks always stayed warm. By dawn, most of them had returned to their natural state of impolite chilliness. The daily routine during these colder months was a symphony of small, determined tasks. Carrying in wood for the fire became a high-stakes race between frostbite and splinters. Tending to livestock required waking up before the sun and negotiating with animals who were, frankly, just as cranky and colder than you. Chickens needed unfrozen water, cows needed to be milked, and one poor soul inevitably slipped on the ice and contributed a fresh tale to the annals of frontier slapstick. Meals were slow cooked, if cooked at all. The cast iron stove stood as both kitchen and furnace, the culinary heart of the cabin. If you were fortunate, you might boil some beans or cornmeal mush into something loosely described as dinner. If not, cold jerky and root vegetables became the menu du jour, and due tomorrow, and due next week. The food wasn't particularly warm, but it was there, and that counted for a lot. Still, despite the teeth-chattering nights and the ice-bearded mornings, humour had a way of surviving. Families told stories around the hearth. Children carved icicles to use as makeshift swords. Someone always managed to fall asleep snoring in just the right rhythm to lull the rest. And laughter, timid but determined, continued to crackle alongside the fire. Perhaps not loud, but warm, As another wintry evening settles over that log cabin in the snowy Midwest, scents of wood smoke and boiled potatoes faintly linger in the air. Outside, the snow thickens, laying another quiet layer atop an already muted world. And inside, the family curls a little closer. Tomorrow, there will be more wood to chop, more fires to coax alive, and a fresh layer of frost to scrape from the inside of the windows. But for now, they sleep, and just beyond the window pane, the wind begins to whisper of what it truly meant, to keep the fire burning. Inside the drafty cabins that dotted the windswept American frontier like half-finished thoughts scribbled on a blank page, pioneer families lived, thrived even, with a stubbornness that could give a mule an inferiority complex. But no matter how stout the walls, or how brave the hearts within them, winter had a way of knocking on the door with icy knuckles, and then strolling in uninvited, wearing a coat made of frost and smelling faintly of wolf breath. This, of course, is where one of the most important and oft overlooked tools of frontier survival came into play: the act of not freezing to death, a surprisingly complex undertaking when trees were scarce, fires smoked like insecure actors auditioning for Hamlet, and chimneys were often more aspirational than functional. Heating a home in 1840s frontier America wasn't so much a science as it was a seasonal improv performance. Starring the family stove, the family's collective body heat, and varying degrees of resigned optimism. When the first real frost curled its fingers around the edges of the window pane. And yes, that's assuming the cabin had any glass at all to get frosty. Families knew it was time to engage in the age-old art of keeping warmish. The primary weapon in this chilly campaign was the beloved cast-iron wood-burning stove, a squat, soot-stained contraption that puffed and clanged like a grumpy old grandfather with respiratory issues. It often occupied center stage in the one-room home. These stoves were versatile, stubborn, and occasionally vengeful when overfed with damp wood. The heat they radiated could make the air nearest them feel like midsummer in Georgia, while the opposite side of the room maintained an Arctic chill that would make penguins feel at home. Children were often assigned the role of woodfetchers, a prestigious title that involved trudging out into the snow at dawn to retrieve firewood stacked inconveniently far from the cabin. It was both a chore and an early character-building exercise. Many a pioneer mother insisted that a stroll through waist-deep snow was excellent for growing bones, a sentiment rarely shared by the rapidly freezing bones in question. Wood, of course, was the precious currency of warmth. Every stick, every splinter, every knobbly log wrestled from the forest or split by hand in a blistered flurry was worth its weight in sighs of relief. Trees that once stood in shade-dappled elegance were now regarded with a utilitarian gleam in the eye. Future heat, future tea kettles, future survival. But wood, in that great twist of historical irony, was not endless. In the treeless expanses of the prairie, where families lived in sod houses with walls made from compressed earth and never-ending hope, the absence of firewood gave rise to what may very well be the least glamorous cornerstone of frontier resilience: dried buffalo dung. Yes, buffalo chips, as they were charmingly called to make them sound less like what they truly were. Collected lovingly by the bushel, stacked near the hearth, and burned with a surprisingly competent flame, chips kept families alive when trees couldn't. Some even claimed they gave off a warm, grassy aroma once burning. Others begged to differ. At night, the family would draw close around the stove, or whatever charred relic passed for one, wrapping themselves in quilts stitched from every imaginable scrap, worn-out trousers, faded calico dresses, and the occasional feed sack that had lived a double life. These patchwork blankets were more than just fabric. They were historical diaries, sewn, pixel by pixel with pieces of entire years. And so, as snow drummed gently on the sod roof or tapped on wooden shingles like a half-hearted visitor, the family would eat their cornmeal mush or stewed beans, pass around a tallow candle, and listen to someone read from a weathered Bible or recite the same 3 stories they always told, the ones that somehow never got old in the bitter stillness of January. Some cabins had gaps between the logs so wide, the children joked you could throw a cat through the wall without touching fur. But tonight, the wind slipped in only occasionally, disturbed no one too much, and the glow of the stove painted flickering constellations on the walls. It was enough warmth to tip the balance between misery and comfort, between struggle and peace. And in the quiet, just after the fire let out a slow exhale and before the last child's eyelids yielded to sleep, the wind's howl outside reminded them of what they'd built, a stubborn bubble of human intention in a landscape vast and profoundly cold. But this bubble, fragile though it was, would hold. Tomorrow, perhaps, they'd share the story of how frontier folks found clever ways to pad themselves against the freeze without the luxury of down sweaters or double-pane glass. But that is a story for another winter twilight, somewhere between the crunch of yesterday's snow and the promise of another long, creaky sunrise. A pioneer family might have woken up with the dubious comfort of realizing, yes, it's still winter. And no, that's not a goose feather poking you in the ribs. It's frost creeping through the cracks in your wall like an uninvited existential crisis. Winter mornings on the American frontier didn't so much begin as they endured. Getting out of bed wasn't a choice, it was a negotiation. The beds themselves were often rope-bottomed, the ropes pulled tight to support a mattress made of straw, feathers, or, when winter supplies ran short, whatever, didn't bite back. Retightening bed ropes was such an evening ritual that the phrase "sleep tight" isn't just quaint. It refers to not falling through the mattress at 3 a.m. Assuming you did sleep and weren't kept up by the sound of wolves making unsettling eye contact with your livestock. Then the morning began with the slow, reluctant scraping of ice off the inside of the window glass. Not outside, inside. Pioneer cabins often possessed insulation in the same way a sieve possesses waterproof sensibilities. And so it was customary that the first one out of bed, and this honor fell almost universally to the family member least capable of forming a counter-argument, was tasked with rekindling the fire. Flints were struck, sparks encouraged, half-frozen logs scowled from the hearth like offended relatives. Eventually, the fire crackled back to life, lending credibility to the notion that survival was, in fact, still achievable. Breakfast began not when one was hungry, but when enough layers had been donned to avoid hypothermia between the oven and the mouth. The meal was practical. Cornmeal mush, perhaps, or something delightfully grim made from salt pork remnants and turnips who had outlived their dreams. If you were lucky, or your last trade with Ebenezer down the path hadn't ended in passive-aggressive bartering confusion, you might have coffee. Probably chicory root pretending to be coffee, but let's allow it that dignity. The hearth was the engine of warmth, the beacon of hope, the inappropriate bedroom heater, and the kitchen's only distinguishing feature. It was not, however, efficient. Most of the heat it produced soared gaily up the chimney, like a bird fleeing taxes. Women, wearing as many woolen layers as they could find without becoming legally considered a quilt. cooked beside the flames. Children huddled close, not for affection necessarily, but to achieve toe-thawing proximity. Frontier families rarely had more than one heated room, if you could call it that. Bedrooms were brisk affairs. Morning routines involved scraping ice off wash basins before warming a bit of water, just enough to splash on the face and offend the senses into alertness. Hygiene was seasonal. Winter was not one of those seasons. But despite the endless cold, there was a rhythm to the survival. Chores went on. Water had to be hauled through snowbanks taller than most uncles. Slop buckets had to be carried out with as much dignity as one could muster, while wearing socks repurposed from someone else's mittens. And firewood. Oh, the firewood. Cutting wood was more than a task. It was a full-time relationship. Courtship began in autumn, involving sweet nothings muttered to axe handles, and by February, the romance had cooled into bitter marital obligation. Still, families found ways to share warmth that weren't measured in degrees. Quilting bees and storytelling evenings defied the cold with echoes of laughter and the warm fuzziness of shared hardship. Historians may overlook the particular courage it took to laugh when you hadn't seen the sun since November and your boots had more holes than optimism. But we won't. And so, another morning tiptoed into afternoon, which tiptoed into the dim hush of evening. Shadows stretched long across the cabin floor as dinner was prepared. Usually something one could stew slowly and sternly for several hours. Lentils, beans, fowl that had unfortunately wandered too close to the wrong snowdrift. Candles were lit with frugal ceremony. Light was a luxury, and the frontier family read tales, well-worn books passed down aloud and together. Or perhaps they simply watched the flames dance and let their thoughts unfold like winter's ice across the pane. Outside, the wind whispered its steady lullaby. Inside, the fire crackled beneath a kettle, and another silent evening in the cold wilderness curled around the homestead like a sleeping dog. And if you could sit, quietly enough, without shivering too wildly, you might begin to hear the slush-thick heartbeat of a community surviving together. Tomorrow, perhaps, we'll linger a while on what these brave souls wore to bed, and whether Long Johns deserved their long reputation. If ever there was a more optimistic invention of the human spirit, it might be the frontier winter bed, a structure so modest, so matter-of-fact, and so determined not to kill you. It was a sleeping device by function, but a badge of survival by morning. And yet, for pioneer families, it had to be enough. The standard sleeping arrangement in a pioneer cabin was, let's say, communal. It was a bit like one of those modern open concept lofts, if the loft had no insulation, no plumbing, and all the inhabitants were huddled together like seals for warmth rather than trend. Beds were often built right into the cabin, part bed, part furniture, part family gathering point. Wooden frames were hand-hewn and filled with mattresses that pioneered their own definition of comfort. That is to say, try not to picture a feather-stuffed marvel of luxury. Most mattresses were stuffed with straw, leaves, corn husks, or, for those who didn't mind a bit of crackling with their dreams, dried prairie grasses. Occasionally, a generous helping of livestock hair, horse or cow, added bounce, or at least an unpredictable texture. The mattress would then be laid on ropes strung across the bed frame, which had to be tightened regularly. Hence the phrase, sleep tight. No, really. Sleep was layered, quite literally. Families would pile quilts, blankets, shawls and carpets, anything that wasn't nailed down or currently in use as clothing, on top of the bed. Children often slept 2 or 3 to a bed, facing opposite directions like oddly dressed battery terminals. Adults curled like commas beneath woolen mounds, peeking out only briefly to cough or scold someone for stealing the warm edge. For some families, true luxury meant the use of a feather tick, a plush, down-filled mattress topper that threatened to smother you if it didn't first bankrupt you. Goose feathers were precious, not just for the softness, but because you had to pluck them from a living goose, which could be hazardous depending on the goose's temperament. And geese, as a species, are deeply committed to their feathers. As for pajamas, let us understand that these were less matching flannel sets, and more whatever you were still wearing when you collapsed into bed. Nightshirts were common, often hand-sewn from flannel or linen, passed down through generations and mended until they attained the approximate texture of a paper towel that's been through one too many wash cycles. If it was extra cold, folks simply slept in their day clothes, plus an extra pair of socks that looked suspiciously like their mittens. And the hot water bottles, forgotten heroes of the night. Long before electric blankets or microwavable heating pads, people poured steaming water into metal or ceramic containers, wrapped them in cloth, and tucked them at the foot of the bed. Sometimes a particularly trusting family would use baked stones, wrapped in rags and nestled under the covers like small, slightly malevolent pets. The lucky ones made use of a bed wagon, a covered wooden frame heated with embers from the hearth, which took the chill off the sheets at the risk of singeing a corner of the mattress, or your hopes. Now granted, not everyone slept inside. During migrations, or for those still building cabins, a thick canvas tent, or heaven help them, a lean-to, had to suffice, which meant digging into the snow for shelter, laying down pine boughs as insulation, and hoping your breath didn't freeze to your own face overnight. As such, it's easy to understand why families didn't always sleep long. They would simply doze in shifts, cycling between sleep, fire tending, and occasionally flailing around to restore circulation to their limbs. And in such conditions, dreams themselves grew humble. Instead of glimmering castles or floating clouds, pioneers dreamed of warm stoves that didn't go out, thick quilts that didn't smell like goat, and mornings when your boots weren't technically frozen artifacts. But still, there was a strange warmth in all this. Not physical, perhaps, but familial. The closeness under those hillocks of fabric, the shuffling of footsteps to stoke the fire just once more, the muttered thanks for a half-warm bed. It bound people together like tight-woven wool. In a world stripped of excess, even sleep became a kind of communal ritual, a way of holding on to each other against all that cold. And as snow whispered against the logs and the last flickers of lamplight trembled before sleep, another kind of resilience curled beneath every quilted heap, silent, stubborn, softly snoring. Soon we'll drift from the stillness of their beds and gently tiptoe into the next frontier of winter life, the challenge of finding food when the earth itself has gone quiet. Snow whispered against the log walls like a secret too shy to be heard. Outside, a wool-grey wind prowled across the crusted drifts, rearranging the landscape with a flair for minimalism. Inside the cabin, however, mattered most, and what mattered inside more than a good, sensible pair of socks. Behold, the humble frontier sock, not exactly a showstopper in fashion history, not rivaling Marie Antoinette's wigs or Cleopatra's eyeliner in terms of historical dazzle, but far more vital, especially when your toes serve as the first casualties in the age-old war between human beings and January. In the great wintry dance of survival, keeping extremities attached was priority number one. This led pioneer families to develop a certain reverence, perhaps even affection, for socks. Thick socks, knitted socks, hole-ridden socks yearning for one last season of service. Socks were handed down lovingly or frantically, like heirlooms, or in some cases, like small, pillowy scrolls of desperation. Those who could knit did knit, usually by firelight, squinting like bespectacled owls, clicking needles together in a rhythm not unlike a ticking clock. Only this one signaled the imminent completion of something warmer than existential dread. Mothers, grandmothers, daughters, even sons. You knit or you shivered. Those were your two winter hobbies, and children would learn early, not just out of necessity, but because tiny fingers made terrific sock-shaping tools. Wool, of course, was the MVP. Sheep, the silent heroes of the frontier sock industry. Their fuzzy offerings were spun, cleaned sometimes, dyed rarely, and transformed into fortifications for feet. If you had sheep, you had socks. If you didn't, you did what many desperate folks did. You wore homespun cotton, inhabited layers, or gave serious consideration to foot rags, which were exactly what they sound like. Cloth strips wrapped around the feet like ancient Egyptian mummies, except without any of the royalty or divine afterlife. Socks were not just essential, they were currency. Bartered, swapped, given in marriage baskets. A pair of hand-knit wool socks could even serve as an apology. Sorry I let the fire go out while you were out chopping logs. Please accept this tube of yarn salvation. And forgiveness was more than likely, especially if the socks reached confidently past the ankles. Drying them, however, became a theatrical endeavor. Pegged to mantel hooks, draped over chairs, or perched dangerously close to the fire, the forgotten sock often bore the scars of such ambition, emerging singed or partially crisped, smelling faintly of toasted sheep. Still, a slightly burnt sock was better than a wet one, unless you enjoyed the sensation of sloshing about the house like a swamp ghost. There were, of course, the classic pairs that weren't really pairs. Each sock in the partnership a different size, different color, older than Uncle Hiram's war stories, but knitters worked with what they had. Creative patterns emerged not as style statements, but as records of what colors of yarn hadn't run out yet. Children, with feet that seemed to double in size every season, were notorious sock pirates. One moment, a carefully stitched pair would be nestled in a drawer. The next, it was spotted galloping through the snow, adorning the feet of a child, insisting it fit just fine. Meanwhile, adults hoarded their precious pairs like squirrels storing slippers for the apocalypse. And let us not forget the bedtime sock. Yes, a sock specifically designated for sleeping, because freezing toes do not make for peaceful slumber. Beneath thick quilts filled with feathers or straw, or, on particularly inventive nights, bundles of newspaper, the frontier folk curled like question marks, their feet sheathed in bedtime armor. The morning ritual, of course, involved peeling them off like aged bananas, trying not to shudder at the damp chill of inevitable holes. Socks were silent warriors in a home besieged by permanent frost. They didn't make headlines or diaries much, but they made evenings bearable. They gave a little wiggle of hope, a smidge of comfort, a reminder that someone, somewhere, had cared enough to flick needles in the firelight for you. So as evening stretched its indigo robes across the sky and embers winked sleepily in the hearth, those woolen foot huggers hung patiently by the stove, drying, waiting, dreaming of another day fighting the cold. And perhaps, just perhaps, Their cozy presence gave pioneers the small but mighty determination to trudge snowward yet again, to keep stoking the fire, to wake up tomorrow, preferably with all 10 toes still accounted for. Night was not the enemy. It was a testing ground, and socks, the unsung uniform. Some warmth, however, didn't come from hearth or foot. It came from indoors laughter, clumsy games, and the way a family shaped the long, dark hours into something almost merry. But the real merriment? The thing that brought back both heat and cheer, that came the moment someone mentioned soup. On winter mornings, before the sun had the nerve to climb over the horizon, a pioneer family's day often began with the subtle, glorious sound of someone cursing quietly while trying to light a fire without setting their hair alight. It was usually Pa, and it was usually because someone, again, generally Pa, forgot to bank the embers properly the night before. Banking a fire, for those fortunate enough to live in a world of thermostats and preheated bathroom floors, was the humble art of preserving hot coals beneath ash overnight, so that in the morning, a simple poking and a few encouraging breaths could rekindle warmth. But should you forget, well, say hello to a 90-minute re-sparking session using flint, steel, and enough elbow grease to power a paddle steamer. Frontier mornings smelled like soot, wool, and sometimes a bit of scorched beard. The cabin walls, chinked with mud and moss, creaked under shifting frost. Icicles hung like overzealous crystal chandeliers from the eaves, and inside, your own breath might look like a ghost slowly fleeing your mouth in search of somewhere warmer. Unlike today's morning routines, which often involve imported coffee, a Bluetooth speaker, and at least 3 skincare products ending in amide, a frontier morning routine was delightfully minimalist. Start fire, try not to die. Children, meanwhile, emerged from their shared beds looking like overstuffed sausages wrapped in every available scrap of wool. Quilts were precious and often homemade, stitched slowly during the warmer months, with bits of worn-out trousers, calico, and occasionally imagination. The best of them told stories. Some quilts even boasted the ultimate frontier luxury, batting made with actual cotton, rather than scavenged moss or flattened squirrel fur, which, though warm, had its drawbacks, namely being squirrel fur. Hygiene was largely a summer memory. Bathing in deep winter was an elaborate production involving melted snow, a lot of patience, and a wood stove with the emotional consistency of a Victorian governess, strict, hot-tempered, and prone to sudden chill. Hair was brushed when it could no longer be ignored. Teeth were technically addressed. As for deodorant, well, society's standards were regionally revised to something more flexible. Breakfast was less meal, more strategy. Cornmeal mush, perhaps enlivened by a few dried apples or the noble presence of bacon grease, was typical. If the hens had been bribed, tricked, or simply begged into laying eggs during the bitter months, those were prized like golden nuggets. Pioneer eggs were not to be scrambled lightly. And speaking of chickens, one of the more reliable household heating systems was livestock proximity. Animals weren't always kept in distant barns. Some households kept them nearby, or in extra dire winters, inside. Chickens might bunk in the lean-to. A cold cow, if especially forgiving, might nap near the hearth. This arrangement had the twin benefits of ambient heat and conversational clucking. Admittedly, it also introduced the occasional mystery lump in the dark. Yet, amidst all this frost-flecked insanity, there was structure. Chores marched forward like icicle-wielding soldiers. Water had to be hauled from the creek, now trapped beneath several inches of ice and bad decisions. Wood had to be gathered, often from a woodpile that had somehow migrated under 3 feet of crusted snow. Flour had to be sifted. Children had to be taught their letters, often by candlelight and with less enthusiasm than they devoted to ice skating on frozen ponds with perilous cracks. And yet, there was an odd piece, a creaky rhythm to it all. The predictability of each task, the quiet familiarity inside sod-covered walls, the undramatic heroism of keeping a fire alive, of feeding spirits and bodies on less than one would think possible. Evenings were lit with whale oil, tallow, or pine knots. Flickering shadows across ceiling beams hung low enough to bump your head and remind you who was boss. Songs were sung, slippers warmed by the hearth, and while snow gathered like pages in a frozen diary outside, inside, families told stories to fill the spaces between silence and sleep. Before long, even the fire would quiet, resting beneath its blanket of ash, waiting patiently for morning to fumble, curse, and coax it alive again, just as it always had. And while the stars wheeled silently overhead, another wintry day fell away, leaving behind a handful of memories and a few more icicles to admire or dodge. But if you listen closely to the crackle of a simmering kettle or the whistle of a northern wind rattling a shutter, you might just hear what came next. A story about community and how neighbors nestled in snowbound hollows or scattered across the frozen prairie found ways to warm each other when the fire burned low. In the heart of January, when the frost clung to window panes like the ghostly breath of a tipsy snowman, pioneer families found themselves locked in a quiet battle with nature's deepest hush. Winter on the frontier wasn't a stormy drama, so much as a long, slow poem. Chilly stanzas of wood-cutting, soup-stirring, sock-darning, and the occasional philosophical debate with a cow. You learned quickly not to argue with the cow. Inside the cabin, warmth was a variable concept. The hearth roared in a valiant effort to keep the cold at bay, but its influence rarely extended beyond a noble few feet. If you were standing near the fire, you were toasty. If you took one step back, you were refrigerated leftovers. 2 steps, and you were a meat popsicle. Life, huddled near the stove. People, pets, and even particularly adventurous chickens gathered close, forging an unspoken armistice in the name of survival. Usually, Oles Bessie the cat would never be caught fraternizing with Dorothy the dog, but come February, they might be found spooning under a threadbare quilt, dreaming of sunbeams and rodents. Every member of the household had their assigned roles. The youngest children often found themselves on sock duty, hauling mounds of damp, itchy woolen footwear to the fire to be dried. A noble enterprise made slightly hazardous by the occasional unnoticed sock invasion. Many an explorer tale began with a child reaching into a crusty sock and realizing it was already inhabited by something with whiskers and very little patience. Meanwhile, Ma, bless her calloused hands, became a winter alchemist, turning varied edible objects into an ever-rotating menu of stew. The word stew covered a broad spectrum: squirrel stew, salt pork, stew, sassafras stalk stew, and a mysterious dish referred to only as last Tuesday's stew again. One suspected Tuesday was not getting any younger. Ma's secret weapon was time. Whatever went into the pot stayed there a long, long while, softened by both heat and hope, until it became either delicious or profoundly forgettable. The smell of cooking was the background aroma of cabin life, mingling with wood smoke, musty mittens, and a whisper of despair from the pickled cabbage barrel. Outside, winter wasn't just a season. it was a house guest. It wrapped the landscape in silence, interrupted only by the crunch of boots or the sudden thump of snow sliding off the roof and attempting to assassinate you. Children braved the outer world in wool-bundled layers that rendered them spherical. Many went out to fetch firewood and returned 3 hours later, having rolled halfway to Missouri. For as much as winter wore on the spirit, it also drew people inward in the coziest of ways. Evenings were candlelit affairs, where Pa might whittle by the fire and retell the saga of that one time he saw a bear blink at him. The tale grew with each telling. Initially, it had been a near encounter. By the 3rd week of January, it was an epic psychological duel between man and beast. Pa always won. Books, if they had them, were read aloud in slow, careful tones. When the ink of the printed word felt too fancy, they dusted off riddles, Bible verses, and folk songs that had more verses than a loaf had crumbs. Sometimes, Pa would pull out the fiddle, a creature slightly out of tune but full of charm, and make the floorboards dance in their own subtle way. Then there were the calendars. Oh, the calendars. They weren't the polished, glossy sorts with kittens and motivational idioms. No, these were stark instruments of motivation. Every day scratched off with the tip of a soot-covered stick. Every X, a silent plea for spring. Neighboring families might wager on what day the creek would thaw, though none of them had any actual stakes to place. The winner merely basked in the smug warmth of predictive prowess. Still, for all the toil and tedium, there were flakes of delight. Frozen windows became canvases for idle fingers. The art of idle children and bored grown-ups mingled on the glass. Little scenes of rabbits and angels, or epic battles between stickmen with snowball cannons. The frontier, after all, forgave many sins except the sin of being boring. And just when it seemed the season might stretch on forever, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift would arrive. A longer drip from the icicle, a bird call out of place, a thickening trickle where ice once ruled. But not yet. There was more winter to be known, more tales to tell beneath the low beams and higher piles of snow. And so, as the wind danced around the corners of the little homestead, our story too huddles near the fire, preparing for what comes next. Out on the snowy frontier there existed a peculiar and essential winter artifact, the bed warmer. A simple instrument, really. Just a metal pan with a hinged lid, filled with embers from the fire, then slid between the covers to turn your icy straw tick into something bordering on survivable. It was the 1800s equivalent of a heated blanket, minus the electricity, and plus a light chance of setting your linens ablaze. Nothing says restful slumber quite like falling asleep while smouldering coal inches from your knees. These bed warmers often became bedtime rituals in themselves, passed like sacred relics down the hall from person to frozen person. Grandmother first, because rank hath its privileges. Then the kids, the baby, wrapped like a turnip in 6 layers of flannel, until finally the weary father might get a swift sweep of the warmer before the embers died with a sigh. Of course, by then the bed would be coated in a fine grey ash, and sleep would come with just a faint note of smoke inhalation. But even the humblest of comforts on the frontier required no small amount of ingenuity. If you didn't have a proper bed warmer, you might try improvisation. A baked brick from the hearth, wrapped in rags so it wouldn't sear through the ticking. Heated stones worked in a pinch, though their dedication to retaining heat was at best uninspired. If nothing else, a very large dog served admirably, though notably difficult to reload. By December, frontier families entered into an almost sacred nightly choreography, a ballet of blankets, embers, socks, and silent prayers that the wind outside would be too tired to knock the roof loose again. Everyone wore some variation of a nightcap, a practical addition that kept the heat from escaping one's head like steam from a soup kettle. Some nightcaps included flaps, others pom-poms, and for reasons lost to time, most made the wearer resemble a blustery librarian. Children, in particular, became burritos of wool. Mothers stuffed pillowcases with straw and tucked them snugly around legs and arms. If a child could move even slightly, more stuffing was added until mobility became a distant memory. Heavy quilts descended like sleepy anvils, and with any luck, the warmth would last until dawn. But not every night was a quiet one. The groaning timbers of a wind-beaten cabin could create a veritable symphony of sorrow. Rafters creaked like remorseful spirits, and the howling wind carried with it every melancholy prairie ghost the family had ever imagined. Many folks, half asleep and properly dazed, would mistake these sounds for wolves or highwaymen, or worse, neighbors dropping by uninvited. Some families countered this terror by tucking in with a book, or, more likely, the Bible or an old almanac. One farmer in Minnesota allegedly read the Old Farmer's Almanac out loud every night from November to March, not for the weather forecasts, but because its brisk tone and irrelevance distracted him from the increasingly aggressive icicles forming indoors. On particularly frigid evenings, the very breath from one's lips would freeze mid-air, pirouette, and clack to the floor like a dropped teacup. Speaking of breath, frontier winters saw families sleeping bundled together in the lofts above their animals, where the shared warmth, animal and human alike, created a rare and precious pocket of tolerable air. Nothing says intimacy quite like explaining to your children that the family cow is sleeping indoors for economic reasons, while Daisy lingers by the hearth and chews cud, like a seasoned houseguest. Of course, the morning ruptured whatever illusion of comfort had been achieved. Toes stumbled from bed to frozen floorboards, water buckets turned to blocks, and yesterday's bread could be better used as a doorstop than a breakfast. Still, the pioneers blinked into the frosty dawn and set about their firewood rituals all over again. Harnessing heat wasn't just about warmth, it was about resolve. Each ember banked in the old iron stove was a declaration of defiance against the indifferent cold, and each bed, warmed by a smoky pan, was a quiet, nightly triumph. Next, we'll drift a little deeper into the heart of frontier food and discover how pioneer families survived the winter with little more than flour, salt, and occasionally sheer force of will. If you ever find yourself bundled in 3 fleece blankets, sipping herbal tea, and thinking, wow, they really had it rough back in the day, you'd be entirely correct. Winter on the frontier was less of a season and more of a prolonged dare issued by nature. Survive me, if you can. And among the many adversaries our plucky pioneer families faced, howling winds, frostbitten livestock, and lively debates about whether or not frozen butter counts as a weapon, none loomed larger or colder than the dreadful ordeal of storing food in negative temperatures. The art, nay, witchcraft of winter food, winter, preservation was equal parts ingenuity and stubborn refusal to starve. You couldn't just stroll into your local general store and demand something microwavable. Microwaves wouldn't exist for nearly another century, and even then, the homestead hearth didn't exactly have an outlet. Instead, frontier families relied on what they had always had: root cellars, smokehouses, pickling jars, and prayers. so many prayers. Now, root cellars carved directly into the earth were nature's refrigerator, cool in summer, chilly in winter, and home to the occasional rat with refined taste. Vegetables like potatoes, turnips, carrots, and onions hunkered down in bins packed with straw or sawdust, staying just dry and dark enough to make it to spring. The cellar also doubled as a hiding place for rogue children during chores, baffled chickens, and that one mysterious mason jar whose contents refused to be identified by anyone, including the person who pickled it. Then there were those who took preservation a step further by taking it straight into the icy grip of winter outdoors. Frontier families knew that if you packed a cow full of salt and smoked it over the course of 3 days, give or take, you could have bacon for weeks. Meat was typically preserved in barrels of brine or hung from ceiling rafters, where it could dry out and attempt to absorb the smells of everything else in the kitchen. The technical term for this household perfume? Eau de soute and sausage. Now, butter and milk posed their own wintry challenges. Keeping milk from freezing solid was a constant battle. Too close to the stove and it curdled. Too far and it transformed into a dairy popsicle with less than popular appeal. Butter, unless carefully wrapped and stored, developed what one might politely call character and impolitely call medieval. Cheese, however, could be somewhat trusted. A wheel of cheddar, aged properly, could outlast both harsh winters and family disagreements about whether the snowdrift blocking the barn was a real problem or just part of the rustic charm. Let's say you're a frontier mother named Abigail. You've got 5 children, 4 hogs, 3 chickens, and precisely 0 interest in fetching frozen parsnips from the shed during a snow squall. What do? You pre-plan. Before the snow started falling, you would have dried apples in the sun, slowly turning each slice until it resembled something vaguely edible. You dry corn by threading kernels onto string, like a seasonal garland, or mash it into hominy. Because when life gives you maize, make mush. And let us not overlook the mighty pickle. Oh, how the pioneer relied on pickling, cucumbers, beets, onions, locusts. Don't ask. If it could fit in a jar, survive a vinegar bath, and be sealed with wax, by golly, it was deemed worthy of the root cellar. Even water had its role to play in this cold, bureaucratic process. Ice was cut from frozen rivers in large blocks and stored in sawdust-insulated ice houses, an operation that required cooperation, strong backs, and the strength of character to resist licking giant frozen cubes out of boredom. A midwinter ice shed was part refrigeration system, part status symbol. Oh, you don't have your own ice blocks? Bless your little frostbitten heart. Remarkably, despite the primitive tools and perpetual risk of food poisoning, pioneer families were deeply proud of their shelves lined with preserves. These rows offered reassurance. In each glimmering jar, a whisper of summer, a promise that winter wasn't forever. Food storage on the frontier wasn't just survival, it was a practice of hope. Every sealed container said, "We are still here. We are trying. We will be warm again someday." And sometimes that hope came pickled in brine with a bay leaf and just the tiniest hint of dill. Now, as the wind outside begins to hiss through the cracks between logs and the woodpile shrinks by the hour, what's a pioneer to do? After the food is set, the next frontier is how to eat it without chattering your teeth into butter churns. But that's a cozy matter for another quiet moment by the fire. There was something noble, foolish perhaps, but undeniably noble, about a frontiersman's unshakable belief in the power of socks. Not just any socks, mind you. Pioneer winter socks were less a garment and more a desperate wool and lint prayer, stitched together by cold fingers beside the fire at dusk. Mothers knitted by the soft scratch of candlelight, threading together frayed bits of yarn, stray sheep fluff collected from the fence, and possibly the very will to survive another freezing week. Now, to understand winter footgear on the 19th century frontier, one must understand that footwear in general was a kind of frontier enigma, equal parts hope, hardship, and hand-me-down. Many families began the season with mismatched boots, variously patched with tin, bark, or old letters from Aunt Martha that had outlived their postal usefulness. Still, the real battleground was not the boot, but what waited inside it. Once snow fell, socks became minor miracles. Some were double-layered with rabbit fur inserts. Others were lined with newspaper, an impromptu editorial review pressed against your calves. This brought new definitions to the phrase breaking news. Wool, of course, was king. Homespun wool held in it the dreams of survival. And it wasn't always alone. When supplies ran thin, and they always did, the pioneers got creative. One journal from a Kansas settler describes stuffing her children's boots with dried moss and goose down, and when that ran out, she lined them with corn husks. The children rustled as they walked, like small ambulatory scarecrows trekking off to school. In especially cold households, stuffing one's shoes with warm stones from the hearth was a common, if slightly toasty, strategy. A stone might cradle your heel like a miniature oven, slowly radiating warmth as you trudge through snowdrifts. Most days, this worked well. Some days, minor foot singeing occurred. It was as if the settlers were conducting a nationwide experiment in slow-motion thermal foot science, and all results were both anecdotal and slightly soggy. Yet even with the warmest foot contraptions devised by human ingenuity and desperation, it was the home's wooden floorboards that posed the first attack every winter morning. Cold as confession and twice as honest, they threatened extremities before the first step was taken. Waking children would wail at the idea of leaving bed, and there are recorded instances in family letters of maternal bribery, promises of molasses on biscuits, or an extra spoon of lard at supper just to coax someone into fetching water from the well with frostbitten toes. Of course, not all socks were homemade. In towns fortunate enough to boast a general store, there were store-bought socks, glorious, impeccable creatures of consistent stitch and mercantile smell. These were furnace-warm fantasies wrapped in brown paper. Some families saved for months to buy just 1 or 2 pairs, and legends swirled around the comfiest brands like red-tailed bison, thick knits, or the elusive buffalo plaid of Providence. How warm were they? As if God himself stepped down and wrapped your feet. One rather theatrical diary reads, "And he brought cinnamon." If a pair of store socks did grace a household, it became communal property. Sometimes they rotated. Father wore them on Sunday, mother on Monday, and on Tuesday they went to the eldest son, assuming he'd chopped the required daily cord of wood without complaint. By Friday, the socks would sigh with exhaustion, but back they'd go on another pair of frost-nipped feet. But perhaps the greatest unsung hero of frontier sockology was the washwoman's line. Socks, once soaked through with melted snow and sweat, had to be dried on lines, strung through the cabin. They hung there like sleepy woolen bats, absorbing the smoke of the fire, the scent of bean stew, and the voices of an entire household talking softly beneath their dangling presence. You might say they bore witness to winter itself. And so, as feet were wrapped, stuffed, and shivered back to warmth, the pioneers taught us a valuable lesson, that perseverance begins at the toes. It's hard to imagine conquest of a continent when your left sock folds under the arch, but somehow they managed. Let us drift now, away from clanky boots and smoky socks, toward a quieter part of the frontier world, where comfort came not from wool, but from words, carries, and perhaps, if one was lucky enough, a freshly baked something from the iron hearth. Even in the thick of winter, the frontier house was never silent. It might have been quiet, yes, layers of snow muffling the outside world under a sugar dusting of stillness, but silence was a luxury rarely known, indoors. Between the crackle of the fire, the distant wheeze of the wind sneaking through chinks in the log walls, and the clatter of boots being scraped or babies being jostled, there was always a little noise to assure you that life, though cold, was still kicking. And the noises coming from a pioneer kitchen in January, well, that was a special kind of symphony. It often began with a groan, not from the house, mind you, but from the person tasked with breakfast duty. Rising before the dawn in a room that felt more glacier than hearth, they'd crawl from their straw mattress nest and migrate toward the stove, teeth chattering like tin soldiers doing the polka. They didn't quite wake up, so much as regain consciousness mid-shiver. Even the thought of unwrapping themselves from their thick bedding felt like treason. Preparing food in those early frontier winters was less a matter of cooking and more a small, hopeful ritual. The coals in the stove might still be smouldering from the previous night, if fortune and good fire-banking technique favoured the brave. Still, it often required a few puffs into the ash, some strategic poking, and no small amount of prayer before one could summon the bare modesty of a flame. Breakfast itself was, shall we say, humble. Biscuits made from lard and whatever flour remained in the barrel. If the hens were feeling generous enough to lay in the cold, maybe an egg or two. But more often it was a porridge, thick and clinging, made from whatever grain was on hand, the sort of meal that stuck not only to your ribs, but possibly to your soul. And through it all, water, sweet, uncooperative water, remained the great household nemesis. The water bucket thawed during the day and froze solid by midnight. This meant that each dawn someone, usually a boy with a hat too big or a girl with mittens too thin, would be sent to the stream, pickaxe in hand, to try and liberate a few scoops of semi-liquid hope for drinking and cooking. Soap was optional. Ice chips were not. Bathing in winter was something of a family negotiation. One didn't waste precious firewood on hot baths just for cleanliness. No, a winter bath was an event. Water warmed painstakingly in kettles. Tin tubs dragged ceremoniously before the stove. The youngest children bathed first, and by the time it was Papa's turn, the water had more skin in it than a fortune teller's teacup. Hygiene, historically speaking, was much more of a suggestion than a rule. Toilets, you ask? Oh, dear heart, outside. Always outside, through snowbanks and sleet, across a yard that might as well have been Antarctica, stood the outhouse like a wooden sentinel of winter sanity. A visit required preparation. Boots, coat, hat, mittens, mental toughness, and the sort of resolve typically associated with Arctic expeditions. And still, there were tales of frozen derrieres and Reader's Digest sessions cut mercifully short by frostbite concerns, yet there was something oddly enchanting about the way families huddled close during these months. Evenings were spent around the stove, sipping weak sassafras tea or shared cider, mending socks, telling stories, or reading aloud by lamplight that smoked and sputtered like it had somewhere better to be. Laughter came easily, perhaps because the cold made silliness feel warmer. Even the sharp crack of tree branches splitting in the frost outside seemed like applause for the warmth they built together inside. They embroidered quilts not merely to pass time, but because a single inch of goose down might mean the difference between dozing peacefully and waking with a nose icier than the milk pail. Each stitch told a story, sometimes literally. Names, dates, jokes, scraps from old shirts, all woven together like a stitched family diary. Outside, the world wore white. Inside, it wore wool and hope, and the occasional squabble over who was hogging the blanket. And still, the days passed. The sun was lazy, barely peeking over the horizon before thinking better of it. But little by little, the families waited and endured, dreaming of spring with the kind of longing usually reserved for long-lost sweethearts or spare pairs of dry socks. Whatever was next, be it frost or chore, or yet another encounter with the outhouse, well, they'd face it together. Now, while the frost climbs quietly back down the window pane and the fire settles into its gentle, glowing hum, we'll drift onward, toward another wintry wonder from the heart of the frontier. Of all the sounds a frontier winter could offer, howling wind, creaking timbers, and the occasional unnerving crack of ice, it was the kettle's gentle bubble that brought the most comfort. In the heart of a one-room cabin warmed more by stubbornness than technology, that little pot of something hot could mean the difference between a grumpy silence and something resembling familial harmony. By mid-December, most pioneer homesteads had already retreated behind snow-blockaded doors, emerging only for necessities, chopping wood, milking stoic cows, and chasing chickens who hadn't gotten the snow memo. Everything else, entertainment, education, even social affairs, turned inward. And so tonight, we dip a spoon into one of winter's sleepiest diversions, the ancient and noble art of the frontier winter pastime. It began with stories, of course. Pioneer families had the Netflix of their time. Grandpa, with a beard full of secrets and a suspiciously dramatic flair, sitting in a straight-backed rocking chair worn down smoother than a liar's conscience, he'd unfurl tales of his own youth, often edited liberally for suspense or to demonstrate the unique dangers of disobeying one's elders. These stories were rarely written down. Paper was too precious, ink prone to freezing, and besides, why write what you could embellish with every telling? Children sprawled on patchwork quilts would listen, wide-eyed as their elders warned of wolves, blizzards, and once a particularly territorial moose who, according to Aunt Martha, could smell cowardice. When stories tired, games took their place. And no, not the kind with screens or dice. Frontier games were straight up minimalist. Think button, who's got the button? Which, at its core, was a wholesome con game where siblings accused each other of thievery for fun. By candlelight, or, if lucky, a spluttering whale oil lamp, the family might play shadow guess. One person's hand would dance against the cabin wall, twisting into odd shapes, and the others had to guess what it represented. Is it a horse? No, it's Ma's knitting hand. Much laughter ensued, followed immediately by mild coughing fits from the ever-present wood smoke. And of course, there was reading. On those magical evenings when eyes could stay open and candles didn't sputter out rudely, families gathered around a single volume, the Bible most commonly, though some had dog-eared newspapers from 10 counties away, or a treasured almanac they treated like holy scripture. Some homes even had novels, carefully smuggled west and reread until pages fell out like autumn leaves. Music, too, wove its way through the long evenings. Fiddles were frontier favorites, compact, cheerful, and able to make any room feel warmer than it was. If someone could coax a tune from a harmonica or belt a hymn with only modest off-keyness, that was as close to a frontier concert as one could get. As they sang or swayed or tapped their boots, snow piled against the cabin door, forging a silent pact with the family inside. We'll keep the world out, you keep the fire in. The more we poke around these winter nights, the more we see it wasn't just survival. It was improvisation, creativity, and the quiet miracle of togetherness. True, the walls were drafty and elbows jostled closer than comfort allowed, but inside those simple shacks, winter was wrestled not with despair, but with distraction, artistry, and an occasional competitive round of apple core toss. At the very bottom of these winter diversions lay one more essential tradition: doing nothing at all. As the wind moaned through the woods and frost etched ferns on the window panes, it was perfectly acceptable, no, expected, to sit in silence for entire evenings. Pioneer silence wasn't empty, but full of shared weariness, quilt-induced paralysis, and the satisfying hum of logs surrendering to the flames. Outside, the night deepened, blue and still and terrible in its beauty. Inside, stories fell into snores, songs into dreams. The last candle winked out, and the glow of coals held the quiet like a breath. And just before everyone's eyes grew too drowsy to open, someone, a child perhaps, whispered, "Tell us about the winter chores tomorrow." Oh yes, tomorrow. The not-so-leisurely side of pioneer evenings awaits. As the pale winter sun yawned over the frostbitten horizon, pioneer families inched toward a well-earned morning ritual, the great and noble lighting of the stove. In frontier homes, this sacred ceremony was less about warmth and more about human survival, disguised in the form of angry steel boxes, known fondly, and sometimes not so fondly, as wood-burning stoves. These stoves were as quirky as the people using them. They hissed without water, smoked whenever guests arrived, and occasionally belched so violently it was unclear whether they were heating the house or signaling for maritime rescue. But these cantankerous contraptions were the heart of the pioneer home in winter. Families huddled around them, like worshippers at an unpredictable church, one where the sermon might include a puff of coal smoke to the eyes. The morning task of coaxing one of these iron beasts into life fell, almost without fail, to the stoic figure in the woolen union suit, usually Pa, who stumbled from bed before sunrise wrapped in every available flannel. With icicles forming in his mustache and pipe-perched heroism glinting in his eyes, he shook out the ashes, stacked kindling, struck the match, and instantly sneezed, since the kitchen window always let in a wind that could redecorate your eyebrows. Once the stove was murmuring with heat, the rest of the family emerged slowly from their bedding piles like groundhogs unsure about the commitment. Children wrapped in patchwork blankets scooted across the floor and positioned themselves, rotation style, near the stove's front, much like rotisserie chickens, but with rougher attitudes about chores. Speaking of chores, winter didn't halt them. It just froze them into new and hilariously frustrating forms. Take laundry, for example, the pioneer's frosty love letter to futility. Dirty clothes still needed washing, so families earmarked one day, often called Blue Monday, to soak, soap, scrub, and swing boiling buckets in a display that bordered on theatrical. Mind you, water didn't come from a faucet, but from a creek or a rain barrel, both of which were usually frozen solid by January. So naturally, some clever soul, likely after soaking their socks in morbid silence, thought to bring snow inside and melt it. This, however, involved carrying pan after pan of fluffy snow inside, melting it down, and discovering it reduced to 3 thimbles worth of water. Children were often recruited for this task, lured by promises of helping grown-ups, which is adult code for exhausting them until they stop asking questions. And what did they wear during all this? In a word, layers. In more words, a truly absurd number of layers. Pioneer fashion in winter offered the inspiring silhouette of a person who might be hiding another smaller person underneath. Wool dresses worn over flannel petticoats, undercoats under overcoats, scarves over hoods under bonnets. It was a matryoshka doll of woolly determination. Of course, not every day was purely utilitarian. Sometimes the wind would go still just long enough for a rare treat: outdoor ice mischief. Pond skating became a frontier form of leisure, though there was minimal finesse involved. It was mostly sliding in boots until inertia gave up. Children, and certain confident aunts, would lace up homemade skates crafted from old blades, bits of wood, or, in one regrettable case, pickaxes. These were not the Winter Olympics, dear listener. They were a test of balance, bravery, and whether or not Mrs. Tuttle's cider had fermented a bit too much. Indoors, entertainment was just as creative. With no radios, no streaming services, and certainly no TikTok, families relied on the sheer stubbornness of human imagination. Homemade shadow puppets danced grotesquely across log walls, and stories were conjured with such drama that small children sometimes applauded out of fear. Elder siblings performed songs on harmonicas with 3 functioning notes, and older family members told tall tales about winters so cold the cows gave butter. In these ways, the family soul stayed warm, even when the toes didn't. Everyone gathered around the fire, or rather, within the general heat radius of it, feasting on beans that always tasted slightly of smoke and biscuits hard enough to outlast the century. The house snapped and creaked each night, as if whispering, "I'm still holding up," barely, while outside the stars blinked behind icy clouds, watching it all with cosmic amusement. And so, the frontier home braved each cold evening, not through technological prowess, but through a rare mixture of grit, laughter, and a collective household plan to survive until the thaw. Somewhere between stove smoke and frozen pants, they managed to find something like coziness. Now, if you'll stay tucked in, next we'll step into a gentle part of pioneer life you may not expect, where quiet and quilts intertwine, and the long nights find music in the simple things. Snowshoes. If ever a device deserved more poetic praise in the rugged annals of frontier winters, it would be those spindly wooden contraptions that looked like tennis rackets for giants and felt like walking in reverse through a very awkward dream. But to the pioneer, snowshoes weren't oddities, they were liberation. They were mobility made from sinew and spruce, the closest thing a person had to a sleigh, without the inconvenience of a horse or a very enthusiastic goat. In the depths of January, when snowdrifts marooned cabins in icy silence, there came a time when someone, usually the one who lost the coin toss or blinked first, needed to fetch something: firewood, a neighbor, or the family cow, who had wandered off in apparent resistance to a snowbound lifestyle. And so, with a hearty sigh and a 4-scarf wrapping ritual that looked suspiciously like preparing a sofa for storage, the chosen soul strapped on snowshoes and shuffled out into the frozen white. The trick with snowshoes, you see, was not speed, it was grace. No, not that kind of grace. The survival kind. Lifting one's knees like a ballet dancer doing a very discouraged plod snowshoers moved in deliberate lunges, like a sleepy moose auditioning for a marching band. But despite their inelegance, snowshoes kept many a pioneer from sinking waist-deep into despair and snow. Mostly snow. Once strapped in, the world seemed both closer and more distant. The muffling effect of snow, coupled with a sky that hovered like an ironed quilt, created a kind of frontier hush. You could hear the soft groan of trees, the eerie whistle of wind slipping through pine boughs, and, if you were very quiet, the distant honk of a raven who had just discovered someone's frozen leftovers and wished to register either joy or complaint. Snowshoe treks were often not noble affairs. They were necessity disguised as exercise. Firewood, stored in twisted cords just outside the cabin, could get buried in hardy snowdrifts by midwinter, identifiable only by the shape of the lump it formed. One might find oneself hacking away at the drift, with mittens so stiff they could be used to discipline naughty kindling. And after retrieving the logs, it was a careful return, like balancing pastries on matchsticks. Trip once, and you'd be redoing that adventure with tears frozen halfway to your cheeks. Food retrieval via snowshoe was its own expedition. Root cellars, those frigid pantries buried beneath several regrets of earth and ice, were often a few wobbling steps from the house. And thus, the fine sport of cellaring was born. This was a game where players tried to get to the potato stash without falling through a deceptive snow crust layer and finding themselves thigh-deep in contrary terrain. Even letters, when they graced the frontier, required snowshoe postage. The mailman, or mailwoman, frontier resilience was happily non-exclusive, would trek from homestead to homestead with a satchel full of dreams, bills, and that one newspaper from 2 months ago. These were often read aloud, front to back, followed by the dramatic rereading of the recipe section in case a single novel use of root vegetables had been missed. Some snowshoe treks ventured farther, across fields, over ice streams, to a neighbour's cabin whose chimney still puffed smoke in hopeful little puffs. These travels weren't just about supplies. They were about survival of the social kind. Humans, it turns out, are not designed to spend entire seasons speaking only to livestock and hearths. Frontier folk understood that the rare sound of another human's laughter bouncing over snowfields was more nourishing than broth. What snowshoes represented, beneath all the wobbling and trudging and occasional face planting, was connection, not just to supplies or neighbours, but to the land itself. To learn to snowshoe was to speak winter's peculiar dialect, to make peace with its barriers by tiptoeing across them in defiance, one wide wobbling step at a time. And so the snowshoers trudged. By day's end, they would return, cheeks rosy, arms sore, souls stretched just enough to remember they were still part of something wider and whiter. They knocked the snow from their boots, unwrapped from their fabric cocoons, and told tales of the wind's mischief, of near misses with spruce roots, of a rabbit with a judgmental stare. They curled next to the fire, steam rising from wet socks and thawing stories, their ankles quietly plotting revenge. Tomorrow might bring deeper snow, or colder wind, or another loaf of bread placed just out of reach. But tonight, they had snowshoes drying by the door and a sky above holding millions of sleeping stars. And not far beyond that snowy door, there waited yet another way the pioneers turned cold into comfort. Imagine, if you will, a long, shadowy evening on the edge of nowhere. Snow like sifted flour dust the roof of a one-room log cabin, its windows glazed not in glass, but with waxed paper, because pioneering luxury sometimes meant creative translucence. rather than actual transparency. Inside our little frostbitten fortress sits the family, clustered tightly together like spoons in a drawer, all angled toward the hearth, the undisputed celebrity of the household. The fire crackles lazily, less roaring blaze, and more medium enthusiasm, its flames huddling like they too wished they had mittens. Now, you've heard of hygge, the Danish art of coziness, but frontier folks had their own version. It involved scratchy woolen stockings, the scent of boiling beans mingled with damp socks, and the uneasy companionship of vermin that pointedly ignored evictions. This frontier coziness wasn't curated for an Instagram grid. It was survival with a side of sass. Night came early in the frontier winter. By 4 o'clock, darkness slinked in like a bored cat, and families would prepare for the long stretch of evening, with activities that required minimal light and even less motion. Reading, if one had the rare luxury of literacy and a Bible or almanac, was done by candlelight, a precious resource made by boiling down tallow that once adorned the resident livestock. Now, speaking of candles, the making of them was a time-consuming, slightly dangerous enterprise that smelled suspiciously of a barn on laundry day. You dip a wick into hot fat, let it cool, and repeat. Dozens of times. If you got impatient, the candle would turn out looking like a lumpy turnip, and nobody wanted to read scripture by turnip light. But let's not pretend the frontier was all solemn piety. Once the day's chores were done, and by chores, I mean the endless parade of fetching water, tending fires, and trying not to perish, there were diversions. Simple though they may seem to us, they offered a kind of magic. Children played games like Button Button, Who's Got the Button, which was thrilling if your recreational baseline was, say, scrubbing a wooden floor with icy water. Parents might string popcorn by firelight, turning stale kernels into festive decor that doubled as emergency snacks. Then there was the fiddle, bless it. If a family was lucky enough to possess one, and someone had the gumption to learn despite numb fingers and minimal daylight, a fiddle could become the heartbeat of the cabin. A toe-tapping jig amidst frozen toes was a victory. And if not music, then stories. Oh, the stories. These tales were part entertainment, part oral survival guide, laden with cautionary morals like, don't trust a goose after dark, or always check under the bed for raccoons before sleeping. That last one grown from regrettably true events. Time itself flattened in those evenings. There was no rush to be anywhere else. Nowhere else existed. The cabin was the universe. Its wooden walls, stuffed with whatever insulation could be mustered, like moss, newspaper, or the family's dwindling patience, became the very edge of the world. As the fire burned lower and eyelids grew heavier, everyone shifted closer. Siblings kicking each other beneath patchwork quilts, the family dog transforming into a woolly foot warmer, and parents murmuring final prayers, hoping that the weather, the chimney, and life itself might be kind tomorrow. Sleep came early on the frontier, and often in layers. Layered clothing, layered blankets, layered humans. The cold had a way of democratizing things. Whether you were the oldest, the baby, or the reluctant uncle who just came for a short visit 7 years ago, everybody got to huddle. And so the cabin exhaled, settling into creaks and sighs as snow whispered on the roof. Another night survived, another page turned in the endless quiet book of winter. Outside, the stars wheel over frozen fields. Inside, time slows, then sleeps. Beyond the frost-laced window, dawn is just a rumor. But something peculiar stirs in the air, a warmth that doesn't come from firewood or wool. It comes from company, from shared breath and bread crusts and stories that crackle even when the fire doesn't. And, as the coals whisper their final lullaby, we begin to wonder, how did those early pioneers bring warmth to their hearts, not just their homes, even on the bleakest winter days? That little mystery waits just past morning. As the frost deepened and the silence of snow settled thick upon the land, frontier families turned their winter focus to one very spirited undertaking: not freezing to death, preferably with dignity, and possibly with pie. In the absence of thermostats, or any heating system more advanced than put more logs on it, pioneer cabins functioned less like homes and more like glorified ovens with occasional furniture. These one-room dwellings were artfully engineered draft simulators, where air leaked in cheerfully from every crevice between poorly fitted logs. Snow, likewise, would politely let itself in through the roof, windows, and the door that never quite closed without a shove, a prayer, and a well-placed quilt. The family hearth, usually a stone or brick fireplace, was the centerpiece of winter survival. You could gauge a settler's mood by their proximity to it. Children were often found napping perilously close to the flames, resembling early American rotisserie chickens. Dogs lay in curling arcs, steaming like dumplings, and adult settlers learned to cook, dry laundry, and grumble all within arm's length of the blaze. If anyone in the family said a nice word in January, it was probably because the fire was roaring and their socks were only mildly damp. Clothing decisions were similarly pragmatic. Layers upon layers upon, well, more layers. On especially cruel nights, it wasn't uncommon to sleep in your clothing, outerwear, and possibly the family tablecloth if it wasn't in immediate use. Frontier pajamas were largely indistinguishable from daytime clothes, except that they may have included additional ice-crusted wool. The more refined frontier families might have even had nightcaps. Not the beverage, alas, but a cone-shaped woolen topper, complete with a droopy tassel and the quiet dignity of someone trying to look fashionable in bed while wearing fur mittens. The most elite among them, by which we mean anyone who owned more than one quilt, deployed bedding tactics that bordered on militaristic. The warmest of the handmade quilts were often stuffed with wool, feathers, or scraps of previous quilts that had given their lives honorably in earlier winters. It was said that a truly great quilt could weigh more than a toddler and smell faintly of kerosene, soap, and grandma's stern advice. To endure the dark months of endless snow, pioneers also reimagined domestic life as a series of indoor marathons. Children were assigned the very important job of keeping the cow water from freezing, a task best performed by smashing the ice several times a day with whatever implement came to hand: sticks, spoons, or, if you were particularly tired, your own forehead. Indoor games included shadow puppets, string cats, a form of entertainment that had the added benefit of using up time and string, and reading the Bible aloud with voices, sometimes substituting in barn animals for minor profits to keep things lively. Speaking of livestock, those lucky enough to have a barn might bring their more delicate animals indoors. Yes, truly. Pigs in the parlour was not just a turn of phrase. A cow in the scullery could provide warmth, companionship, and the thrilling risk of unfortunate surprises underfoot. Chickens slept wherever they could get away with it, and ducks had a tendency to judge everyone. Food, of course, was a major preoccupation, and nothing warded off the chill quite like constant chewing. Soups were stretched, bread was rationed, and molasses, bless its sticky, treacle-slow heart, was poured on everything that wasn't fleeing. Winter meals were hearty, heavy, and designed to generate internal combustion, particularly in those moments when the firewood ran low and someone had to brave the outdoors to fetch more. That someone was usually the youngest person whose boots still fit. Yet despite the cold, the cracked hands, and the uninvited presence of goats in the living room, there was a warm pride in making it through each day. A pioneer winter was less about fighting the elements and more about outlasting them, with cunning, patience, and the willingness to stuff your socks with straw. And as the wind howled its low, wintry lullaby across the snowy fields, somewhere a mother tucked in her children beneath a mountain of quilts, kissed their frosted foreheads, and whispered stories of kinder weather to come. Of all the silence winter demanded, none was as sacred or as still as the hour before dusk, the twilight hush when the chores were done, and even the fire seemed to crackle more softly, like it too had settled in for the night, a time when the world outside could vanish behind a veil of frost, and inside all was warmth, reflection, and the quiet scratch of pen on paper as someone, perhaps by candlelight, began to write. A letter. As the prairie winds howled and the moon rolled languidly across the sprawling winter sky, another kind of survival skill emerged in frontier cabins, not involving fire or food or homemade socks, but something infinitely more elusive. You see, surviving winter wasn't just about keeping warm, it was about keeping sane. Out there, wrapped in snowdrifts deeper than a wagon wheel and surrounded by muffled silence, time itself seemed to slow to a glacial crawl. Pioneer families, confined to one-room cabins for months, faced a predicament not unlike being permanently snowed in with your relatives during a board game night that never ends. Cabin fever didn't arrive with fanfare. It crept in quietly, wedging itself between routine chores and the recitation of psalms. With little sunlight and even less space, tempers could fray like a poorly spun wool blanket. The pioneer way wasn't just stoic. It occasionally required a well-disguised sense of humor. When Aunt Edith started naming the logs in the firewood pile, no one questioned it. Better a cheerful Edith chatting to a bundle of birch than a bored Edith wondering aloud just how sharp the kitchen knife was. To fight the creeping dullness, families spun creativity out of necessity. Children, bound indoors by wind and frost, invented elaborate games using corn cobs, buttons, or anything that could be shuffled around like pretend livestock. They made tiny bowler hats for mice, or at least claimed they had seen the mice wearing them. Entertainment did not need to be entirely factual. Storytelling became more than pastime. It became a lifeline. Each night, with the wind keening outside like a misplaced banshee, parents would hush the room, lift the quilted cocoon slightly, and share tales. Some were true, some slightly true, and some more embroidered than a Sunday bonnet. Many featured hungry wolves, resilient settlers, and occasionally a goat who could speak fluent Latin, though no one quite remembered why. Books were precious, but scarce. If a family owned a Bible, an almanac, and perhaps one heartily dog-eared novel about a gallant sea captain, they were considered the neighborhood literati. Pages were read and reread until phrases took on mythic resonance. No one remembers Captain Brewster or his ship, the Willow exactly, but half the valley could quote his dramatic monologue about facing down a kraken with a tin cup and deeply personal confidence. When not reading or narrating, families turned to music, but wistfully, quietly, so as not to disturb the icy hush. Fiddles were popular and often slightly out of tune from the cold, sounding less like Mozart and more like a musical saw being interpreted by squirrels. But the sweetness of a fiddle line in the dusk lifted hearts even more than the smell of potato soup, a true frontier feat. Singing was beloved, though limited by the audience's patience. Favorite hymns, old ballads, and tunes adapted from neighbor families and altered beyond recognition, echoed across cabins like lullabies stretched across miles of snow. Occasionally, new songs were invented merely to describe housework. The ballad of the missing boot, or the haunting ditty, "Where did I put the bacon grease? Oh no." Even personal hygiene became part of this odd winter theatre. The weekly bath, luxurious, tepid, and publicly scheduled, gave everyone something to complain about and something to look forward to. The youngest children went first, followed by the increasingly older and less enthused. By the time it was Papa's turn, the bathwater was more metaphor than liquid, but the ceremony endured. It wasn't just about being clean. It was about being a little less bored. And then, of course, there were crafts. The act of making, quilting, whittling, carving spoons nobody quite needed, sustained many through the grimmer weeks. A well-crafted cornhusk doll could hold more personality than entire plays. And nothing started small-town drama quite like a decorative butter mold shaped like the neighbor's horse. This daily patchwork of oddities and ingenuity, of mood swings softened by mending socks and hymn-singing mice, is how pioneer families preserved a kind of mental warmth. Even in the coldest reaches of winter, the mind wandered, sang songs, played games with shadows on the wall, and told stories large enough to fill the silence. Tomorrow's dawn would bring the promise of yet another cinnamonless day, punctuated by chores and the slow melting of snow captured in a tin bucket. But tonight, tucked beneath buffalo hides and patch quilts, the whole family drifted toward dreams, lulled by the familiar squeak of wind against wood and the comforting sound of a fiddle playing very nearly in tune. And just over the next snowbank of our story, something warmer stirs. Not a fire, not yet, but the quiet, almost magical rhythm of thaw. One of the quiet ironies of pioneer winter life was that while the world outside was barren and still, inside the cabin, things were bustling. Not with excitement precisely, but with a sort of determined coziness born of necessity. Winter was less a season and more an occupation. One didn't merely survive it, one endured it full time. And at the heart of every winter household was a small, dark miracle: soap. Now, one doesn't think much about soap while they're drifting towards sleep in a 21st century fleece robe, freshly showered with 12 kinds of botanical extracts. But for the frontier family, soap making was a serious, if slightly aromatic, business. Between melting snow for water, patching shoes with twine, and drying out kindling in armpits, someone had to make the stuff that kept you from smelling exactly like the inside of your winter boots. The process began with accumulated kitchen grease. Every ham crackle, every beef drip, every errant bacon fate was lovingly collected in a tin near the hearth. Over time, it gained a life of its own, curling at the edges and letting off faint whispers that hinted at every meal cooked since Halloween. This was called rendered fat, though more often went by its frontier nickname, soap gunk. Next came lye. Not the kind you buy in neat plastic tubs now, but the kind conjured from wood ashes, leftovers from the fireplace, which were soaked in rainwater or snowmelt in old barrels until the solution was strong enough to dissolve a feather. As a test, families would occasionally dip a chicken quill in and observe its fate, raising fascinating questions about who first discovered this and at what cost to their flock. Mixing lye with fat was among the more high-stakes winter activities. Get the balance wrong, and you had either explosive soap volcanoes or a sad sludge that could only be used to soften boots. The goal was a thick, mildly caustic paste poured into wooden molds, usually the same shallow pans used for cornbread, because in the frontier economy, everything had at least two purposes, one of which was always soap. Stories abound of entire barns smelling suspiciously antiseptic come February, thanks to overzealous batches made during long cold spells. There were whispers of one Uncle Gideon who once mistook a square of lye soap for cheese, which ended with a moral lesson and a very quiet dinner. But if soap was the quiet saviour of the cabin, leather was the long-suffering sibling, forever needed, always cracking. Winter was unforgiving on boots and mittens alike. Boots eaten at the toes by wood stove heat, mittens frozen stiff on the laundry line like oddly shaped pie crusts. Entire evenings were devoted to the delicate surgery of item repair. Needles were fashioned from scavenged bone or wire, and thread might come from sinew or ravelled shirt hems. Children were enticed with stories to sit still while their last pair of socks was carefully darned straight onto their feet. It wasn't tailoring, it was cold weather performance art. And then there was the leather grease, a potion consisting of rendered lard, beeswax, if you were lucky, and just enough soot to give it character. Warmed by the fire, it was rubbed lovingly into boots that reeked faintly of everything cooked in the last 3 months. A good boot, properly greased, was practically waterproof. A great boot deserved a name and its own cot. Inside those boots, however, were the pioneer's secret weapon against frostbite, newspaper. Not for reading, mind you. Frontiersfolk had very little breaking news to worry about, but crumpled tight, it made surprisingly effective insulation. Whole editions of the Franklin Gazette spent January protecting toes rather than enlightening minds. If the feet stayed warm, the spirit had a fighting chance. And for all the talk of grit and resilience, the heart of winter survival came down to small, humble acts: rubbing oil into leather, boiling down soap scraps, stitching a thumb back onto a mitt with thread that once held up overalls. These were quiet rituals, repeated by candlelight and swear words softly muttered under breath. For children, watching these tasks was its own sort of learning. Not grand lessons, but practical knowledge passed down by mitten-clad hands. How to make do, how to mend, how to warm, how to wait. As the snow continued to fall in a hush outside, and the cabin creaked like an old violin settling into tune, the pioneer family settled by the stove, content with a day of small victories. Soap that cut through grease, boots that stopped leaking, toes that still had feeling. And tomorrow? Well, tomorrow had plans all its own, starting with something perhaps even more precious than soap: the return of sunlight to the kitchen window. But that's a quiet story for another time. In the hush of a winter night, when the fire had settled into a quiet glow, and the wind outside made eloquent arguments against leaving the cabin, the pioneer family turned to their most invaluable source of heat, each other. Not metaphorically, mind you. They physically huddled, layered like flapjacks gone horizontal, bundled in shared effort to outlast the cold's persistent whisper. It wasn't sentimentality that made these arrangements so snug. It was survival. Beds, if they could be called that, were often straw ticks. Large canvas or linen sacks stuffed with straw, corn husks, or sometimes feathers, if one was fancy or had recently lost a goose to destiny. These mattresses were placed close to the hearth, and in cases of severe weather, sometimes quite literally in front of it. There was no shame in practicality. Children were packed into bed like cordwood, often sideways to optimize space and blanket coverage. Arguments about who got the itchy end of the blanket were muffled by the fifth shivering hour. And grown-ups, perhaps formerly concerned with modesty, quickly learned that the frontier had its own ideas about priorities. Sleeping fully clothed was less about fashion statements and more about reducing the daily trauma of redressing in chilled garments. Nighttime routines were punctuated by the soft clanking of the fire iron, the occasional sneeze from inhaling smoky air, and the shuffling of someone sneaking off to the chamber pot, an artifact of frontier life that added insult to injury when cold porcelain met skin. The pot itself was a source of marital debate. Too close to the bed and it was unpleasant. Too far, and one might as well have journeyed to Canada. Despite the hardships, winter nights weren't entirely joyless. In fact, there was a strange intimacy to them when families spun yarns, even if they didn't have any sheep. Oral storytelling was not only entertainment, but a light in the long, dark stretches between December and the first hopeful drip of a rooftop thaw. Grandparents spun tales of impossible winters, always colder, always snowier, always involving a runaway cow, and children listened with wide eyes, half fearful, half comforted by the fact that the cow eventually returned, usually smarter than before. One of the cozier secrets of frontier living was the use of warm stones. River rocks heated in the hearth would be carefully wrapped in cloth and tucked into the foot of the bed. These primitive hot water bottles were effective, if slightly optimistic. By morning, they held all the warmth of a forgotten handshake. Still, they were a minor miracle in a world where socks froze mid-dry. The cold tightened daily routines into rituals. Mittens were dried not by a radiator, but tied with string and slung near the hearth like awkward seasonal ornaments. Breakfast began with hammering open the water pail, which often froze despite an indoor spot of honor near the stove. Tea and coffee, if available, were hoarded like precious coins. And everyone, from baby to blacksmith, learned the art of keeping their feet moving during the morning chores. Stillness was an invitation for frost to move in. Oddly, the cold could also bring out unexpected generosity. Neighbors helping neighbors thaw out livestock watering holes or sharing the last of the dried apples when a storm had cut off travel. Pity the frontier bachelor who, having no one to help him and only a sourdough starter for company, might find himself snowed in with only his own thoughts and attempts at banjo. And then there was the weather itself, a theatre of drifts and squalls, and the kind of hush that only falling snow can produce. Pioneer children, not yet aged into worrying about how much firewood was left, might press their noses to foggy window panes and imagine snow creatures hiding between the trees. The stillness outside was almost holy, if the saints had shivered more and prayed for mittens. So while the cabins were spare and the stoves temperamental, there emerged a rhythm to winter endurance, a heartbeat powered by wool, wood, and willpower. Peace, in those moments, came from the inside out, from stories exchanged around the hearth, from hands held under quilts, and from the stubborn warmth kindled not by coal, but by companionship. And as February creaked toward its sleepy finale, and the icicles began to drip with shy optimism, the pioneer family sensed the subtle shift. A thin beam of morning sun slicing through the frost-laced window pane, a goose call in the distance, the barest hint of mud under the snow. But winter, being a tenacious guest, wasn't quite finished yet. By the time winter had crept fully into the bones of the land and turned every fence post into a frozen sculpture, the pioneer family had already learned all the fine arts of surviving the cold, and just enough of the comedy that came with it. For while the frontier was lethal in many ways, it never lacked a strange, frosted sense of humor. Take, for instance, the socks. By February, a pioneer's socks had seen more patches than a political campaign, and each toe had a higher chance of seeing daylight than the sun did. And yet, those threadbare wool creations were priceless. Families would rescue them from the frozen wash line with all the ceremony of retrieving heirlooms, and once thawed over the stove, they sobered into service once more, slightly singed, slightly damp, and wholly essential. Houses, meanwhile, creaked like elderly relatives whispering secrets to themselves. The log cabins contracted in the cold until their roof boards and wall joints popped softly, sleepily, like popcorn that had given up. Occasionally, a draft would slink indoors, polite as a ghost, and settle companionably at your feet. No one quite invited it, but then again, no one could entirely evict it either. Inside, life huddled closer. Children told stories lit by lantern light, carefully recalling tales their parents stumbled through before, and always adding details. A bear grew larger, a snowstorm more epic, a sled ride faster than logic. These tales were passed along like sourdough starter, just alive enough to carry forward, and never quite the same from one telling to the next. Oral tradition, after all, is just a form of very slow-motion improv theatre. Meals were humble, often spooned from chipped enamel pots, but the ritual of sharing warmed more than just bellies. Breads that had taken the better part of 2 days to coax out of coarse flour and sour breath were torn carefully into equal chunks. Lard might be spread on with reverence, and molasses, the royalty of winter condiments, was treated like liquid treasure. Its emergence from the root cellar was a small occasion, less about flavor than the reminder that a little sweetness could still be found, even when the world had been whited out. The outhouse, tragically separated from the house by a country mile, or let's say 30 paces that felt like a mile, became a theatre of daring. Venturing out meant navigating ice, darkness, and stalking raccoons with nothing but your sense of urgency to guide you. Folks would return from it with tales to tell and extremities to thaw. Occasionally, a parent might exaggerate the perilous path to the outhouse, just enough to assign it to a child next time. Pioneer delegation, we'll call it. Evenings were a symphony of creaks, wheezes, and muffled sneezes. Quilts stacked as high as modesty allowed. Stockings hung not just by the fire, but over every available knob, peg, or dangling nail. There was, of course, that one stubborn log in the fire ring that refused to ignite until exactly 2:47 a.m., at which point it would crack loudly enough to wake the dog and startle at least one adult into thinking the barn had exploded. And yet somehow, there was profound peace layered beneath that rustic racket, the quiet kind, the content kind, not the eerie stillness of an unchecked silence, but the hush that follows good, hard work, full bellies, and the shared solace of simply making it through another frigid day. They weren't thriving, not exactly, but they were enduring, creatively, collectively, and quite often while wrapped in 3 layers of flannel and one garment no one could identify. In the end, surviving winter on the frontier wasn't just braving the storm. It was developing an uncanny knack for laughing through your chattering teeth, for sharing what little you had, and for finding unlikely joy in joints warmed by timber stoves and feet tingling after a brisk sprint from the outhouse. And as the wind outside softened its howl, just momentarily, and the last log gave a sigh in the hearth, the world inside that drafty little cabin seemed almost warm. Or perhaps it was the people who filled it, patched and frostbitten, sturdy and stubborn, who made it so. Now close your eyes and let the quilt of history pull up to your chin. Let the wind settle into a whisper, let the logs creak just so, and drift off with the firelight flickering gently behind your dreams. You made it through another long winter after all.